Welcome back to Against the Cage, your home for all the latest that's going on in the world of MMA, including exclusive interviews with all your favorite fighters and figures in the sport. My name is Jake Aryeh. I'm joined here by my esteemed co-host, Scott Fontana. Our other co-host, Eric, is off this week, but he will be sorely missed. Now, this week, there was massive news in combat sports pertaining to a very important piece of legislation in boxing. This week, the House passed House Resolution 4624, officially titled the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act. That's now going to the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. We have someone who knows a lot about this subject. Scott, would you care to do the honors of introducing our guest?
Yeah, absolutely. So joining us today, and you can see him already on our screen, he's been sitting there nice and patient, is John S. Nash, the host of the Hey Not the Face podcast. He's perhaps the most knowledgeable reporter in the combat sports space when it comes to matters of the business end of the fight business, particularly when it involves matters of antitrust. His work has appeared for many years, or had appeared for many years in the original Bloody Elbow, and now appears on Uncrowned. And he has been a valuable resource to me on more than one occasion in the past. So, John, welcome to the show. How's it going?
Good, good. Thanks for having me on. I mean, there's not much going on in the news, so
Quiet week.
appreciate
Yeah,
me
quiet
just
week.
coming
Glad
in
to have
just
you.
to chit chat and see what's going on.
Well, thank you
Sure,
very
sure.
much for joining, John. This particular piece of legislation is something that I'm very interested in and, try to sink my teeth into. But for those who haven't yet, in layman's terms, could you briefly give our viewers an overview? What is this legislation?
Well, the bill that was passed by the House of Representatives, just for non-Americans, one of the two chambers of Congress that we have in the United States, the bill is the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act. And this bill, which proponents claim does not change the Ali Act, what it does is introduce new provisions that amend the Professional Boxing Safety Act, which was a bill passed in 1996, and introduce a new concept called UBOs. I will contest the idea it doesn't change the original Ali Act, which was a bill passed in the year 2000 pushed by John McCain and was intended to offer economic protections for boxers. What I contest about that argument is that, yes, it doesn't change a word of the original Ali Act, but what it does, it exempts these UBOs from having to comply to the Ali Act. And I think that's right there, that's a change. I mean, I might be mistaken, but when you don't have to do something, that kind of is a change in the rule structure, I would argue. But so that's the new bill was passed by the House. It has to go to the Senate now. And so really briefly, what it does is it adds several new protections for boxers across the landscape, enforce greater drug testing, enforce insurance minimums, higher insurance minimums, enforces a higher minimum purse per round for boxers, has a rule regarding the number of titles that a sanctioned organization can have, and then introduces a concept called a unified boxing organization, which is basically allows promoters to enact a UFC model in boxing, which was illegal before.
Okay, thank you so much. And let's talk about that initial legislation and what made it so important from that legislation that passed in the 90s. What was so important about it when it first passed for us to understand, what's happening now?
Well, briefly in the Professional Boxing Safety Act, that was a bill that was intended to improve the health and safety of boxers, and it actually did a lot of important stuff. It had a licensing requirement for boxers; they never had that before, and so it complied. It had got the ABC, the Association of Boxing Commissions, to honor each other's suspensions of fighters. And so it introduced several things that actually were really big changes for boxing, really important, because at the time boxers, I mean, there were practices where boxers would basically go from one state to another and then pretend they're someone else just to get an extra fight because they got knocked out a week before. And this is that you had to get a license, an ID that was unique to you, so that way they could track your number of fights and where you're fighting. And that way also you couldn't go to another territory, another state, another commission to keep fighting, even if you were suspended in one state or you had, a knockout protocol suspension, whatever. They could enforce that nationally. So that was important. But it was missing a key ingredient, and that it didn't have economic protections, because the history of boxing is exploitation of the boxers. And so in 2000, John McCain got the Muhammad Ali Reform Boxing Act passed, or Boxing Reform Act passed. And what that did is it introduced several clauses that were intended to protect boxers. It put up a firewall between promoters and managers that for 10 rounds and above. I guess I should note this. One thing I think people miss is when they look at the original Ali Act, they're like, well, it doesn't do much for the bottom fighters. And that's kind of intentional. It was targeting higher end, the stars, the higher rated fighters, because it's in many ways an antitrust bill. It's trying to prevent concentration. It's trying to increase competition. And boxing's a top-down sport. And so if you control the top, you kind of control the sport. And so they targeted a lot of this stuff towards the top of the sport for the protections, because they wanted to prevent the promoters from, attaining monopolies over that, or over, weight class or championships. In fact, if you read the bill in the report, it talks about the threat of promoters monopolizing weight classes. It's a competition bill. It's against restraints of trade. These are all antitrust terms. And so one of them was they tried to prevent put a firewall between managers and promoters, because they have two different duties. The promoter's there to make as much money as possible off the boxer. A manager has a fiduciary duty where his job is to make the boxer as much money, and then they get paid from that. And so it's supposed to be an adversarial relationship between a promoter and a manager. And so they wanted to make sure that they did not have, there's a firewall between them so that that relationship was not blurred at all. They introduced a requirement that promoters had to disclose the compensation they were going to make from a bout to the fighter. Now, one of the problems was they never defined the time frame that they had to do it. Often they'll do this right before the fight. The promoter will tell the boxer. But the idea was the boxers should know how much money that promoter is making off their fight. It might not help in this fight, but then the next fight they can go and say, listen, I do not want that. I know that you're getting paid a lot for when I fight. I want a bigger purse. That was the second one. The third provision they put in, they put in some protection separation between sanctioning organizations and promoters as well, and then put in some requirements about how sanctioning organizations' ratings should work. Because they did not want sanctioning organizations basically, selling. They were, at the time, it was very corrupt, and still is in some ways. But at the time, it was openly known that promoters were basically buying spots from the sanctioning organizations. So they wanted to put some separation there as well. And finally, what may be the most important change they did is they introduced a prohibition against coercive contracts. And this is something I think confuses a lot of people, because a coercive contract is something kind of specific in boxing. What that is you cannot require a boxer to sign over long-term rights to you in exchange for a bout. An example of that is if I was a promoter and I had a top-ranked fighter, and you had another fighter wanted to fight my top-ranked fighter, I cannot tell them that you have to sign over your rights to me for 5 years. That's a coercive contract. The most I can ask for is 1 year of options. This is really specific to titles, because, if a title fight, if you want to fight the champion, just think of that. If you want to fight the champion, I'm the promoter of the champion, I could demand in the past, you have to give me 5 fights in the future if you win. Well, then I'm the promoter of the champion no matter what. I win no matter what. And I can use that championship that I control to get concessions from the boxers that want to fight the champion, because it's their lifelong goal to be the champion, and being the champion does make you a more valuable boxer. So they introduced this coercive contract provision, and they've made it stronger with mandatories. If you're a mandatory, you cannot ask for not even the 12-month option. You can't ask for any options. And that was the biggest change, I think, to the bill, and that's been the most successful part. If you talk to people that worked in the industry in the 90s and after, I've talked to Pat English, Lou DiBella, Kurt Emhoff, Shelley Finkel, you just go down the line, several other people, Leon Margolis and stuff, they will tell you that the coercive contracts, while not 100% eliminated, just look at what Don King and Bob Arum were doing in the 90s, and then look at what happened afterwards. You do not see even a fraction of the number of boxers being required to sign over long-term agreements just to get title fights. So that was the number one change right there.
Obviously, Titanic ramifications came from that, right? With ripple effects that we felt for a long time. Those were, of course, limited to boxing. We are an MMA podcast here. We talk all about MMA. You are all too familiar with mixed martial arts, and particularly the way the UFC has done business. And some of the ways you're discussing here are not too dissimilar from what we've heard, and some of it is your own reporting over the years with regard to the UFC. But the question I have for you, though, and this is still about boxing here, is how this legislation, once it makes its way through the annals of our legislative process and makes its way to Donald Trump's desk, presumably signs it. How is this going to affect, all the different entities involved, fighters, managers, promoters, commissions, boxing itself in the United States in particular?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know exactly what's going to happen. But based on the
Granted.
history of what happened in the past, we have examples of how these coercive contracts and control of the titles worked in the past. We have a case called the International Boxing Club of New York case, where they monopolized championship level boxing through those practices. We have the examples of Bob Arum and Don King in the 80s and 90s, where they basically monopolized weight classes. If you were a heavyweight boxer, for years, you couldn't, unless you signed with Don King, you couldn't get a shot at the heavyweight title. And so he controlled the heavyweight ranks that way. So we have that tradition. We also have the example of the UFC. I mean, the cases I just cited, the legislative history of the Ali Act and the International Boxing Club of New York, that is raised in the UFC antitrust case. Those are used as examples of what the UFC practices have done. And how that's a different from boxing, because boxing has these protections against this sort of action and the MMA doesn't. So the UFC has been, that's part of the ingredients to their magic scheme, which they monopolized or monopsonized MMA. So if I look at boxing, I think in the short term it's not going to change much. I think that the UFC, I shouldn't say the UFC, TKO and Zuffa Boxing are intent. They have money from the Saudis. They're going to spend a lot. Pay will probably go up for the current fighters as they try to sign top fighters. The concern I would have is 5-10 years down the line, if TKO manages to get the top fighters under contract with TKO, and the opportunity, the only opportunity you can have to fight them, because again, combat sports is top heavy. You become the top fighter in the world by beating the previous top fighters or the people the public recognizes as the top fighters. So if all those guys are signed to this Zuffa boxing entity, then all the fighters outside, if they don't have protections against coercive contracts and they're not allowed mandatories, then they will be required to sign with Zuffa Boxing in order to get those fights. And when Zuffa at that point has that leverage under the system, then you can start seeing them do what they do with the UFC. They will offer rates that are lower than what we see with star boxers. That's why MMA fighters make less than top boxers. They will start demanding concessions in order to get that agreement. I mean, that's why when you get to the top of the UFC, you have to sign, the fighters all have 8 to 10 fight contracts. They are not doing what Canelo Alvarez and Bud Crawford and Conor Benn seem to be doing. We're signing 1, 2, 3 fight agreements and then moving on to a bigger contract. So that's the potential future I'd be concerned about, is that they will be able to concentrate the top fighters under their umbrella, and then everybody else will feel required to sign with them. And once the UFC, again, I use the UFC, the TKO, Zuffa Boxing has that leverage, and they're allowed to use coercive contracts, then boxers may find that they might have to accept much less in pay and accept much longer terms, less favorable to them than they had in the past.
You actually answered my next question a good bit. I just want to clarify. The initial legislation, like you said, was sort of built for the top level fighters, but it sounds like the ramifications that this could have kind of like you just alluded, would trickle down to perhaps the club level fighters. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the point was they were trying to prevent a promoter or manager, either one, getting a concentration of all the top fighters, and that you had to work with them. You had no option but to go to that promoter. because then they'd have all the leverage, and then that would trickle down where everybody has to serve that promoter. And we kind of see that in MMA where there's no options because everybody's in the UFC. I should note the original Ali Act, it is true though, it didn't work. I mean, it did some things. The course of contract provision, I think, did work. But overall, the bill failed to do what they wanted to do. But it all should be noted they knew it didn't work. Very shortly after the original Ali Act was introduced, they were trying to propose and introduce new legislation to amend the Ali Act, to fix it, to improve it, to strengthen it, to add other protections. And they tried for years, and yet that bill, that amendment was attacked, was resisted by the athletic commissions because they were afraid it would take away their power. It was resisted by the promoters. It was resisted by various members of the media for whatever reason, and it was also resisted by Zuffa at the time, the UFC, who lobbied heavily against it. So, the entities that were against that original bill that would have fixed the problems of the Ali Act are now firmly behind this new bill, which I find somewhat ironic.
Yeah, that's fair. And one question I have for you too is, we're talking about the UBOs and we're talking about Zuffa Boxing as kind of the lead proponent here in terms of trying to position themselves. They're already essentially operating. It certainly looks that way within kind of the new guidelines rather than the current ones. But the question I would have, and correct me if I'm wrong, but also if there's any potential, like, do you see any potential for other entities to really come in there and create their own UBOs that will rival the UFC and still allow for competition to be present in this space?
I mean, it's possible there'll be other UBOs. The problem is, one is the bill was obviously designed. I mean, it seems obvious TKO wrote the bill, that they wrote it themselves and handed it to people because the UBO structure, we know one is allows the UFC model in boxing, but it has all these requirements to be a UBO. And you look at the requirements, you need a training facility and rehabilitation center for your boxers. You need drug testing, random drug testing yearly. You need insurance outside of the competition for injury insurance. You need, additional ambulances at events, all these things. And you look at it, well, all those things are stuff that the UFC already does. And what makes that specific is boxing promoters traditionally have worked on very low margins. The reason a boxing promotion is not worth a ton of money, even if they generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, is because their profits are very low because they have to pay the fighters a tremendous amount of money. Whereas the UFC and other MMA promotions have tried to follow suit, is they're incredibly valuable because they make a ton of money because they pay the athletes very little. And so they have a huge amount of money to work with. So boxing promoters have very little money to work with. And then you add these additional costs. And for Zuffa Boxing, well, to add the insurance policy, it's not that much more expensive because they can group it, they can bundle it with the UFC insurance policy. And so what they're paying to the insurer is probably going to be a much lower rate than what another promotion is going to have to do to launch this from the ground up. They're going to have a smaller pool of fighters to work with. And so they will have to pay more per boxer than what Zuffa Boxing's paying. The same with that's the insurance policy works that way. The same with drug testing. They can group it with their in-house drug testing now, so they save there. They already have their performance institute built, so there's no additional cost to include that for Zuffa Boxing, where another promoter has to do this from the ground up. So they start with all these advantages, and every other boxer has a hurdle on top of the fact that they're working with very low margins. So it's hard to see how many other boxers are really, or boxing promotions are really going to follow that path and create their own UBO. I think there's the most likely one, I think, would be like MVP, because they have the women's divisions and Zuffa Boxing's not doing women. But that means you're not really competing with the UFC, or again, I keep saying the UFC, it's synonymous, but Zuffa Boxing TKO, because you're not competing for the same talent. You're just working, you're another promotion in the space, but with different pool of athletes to compete, that are operating. So you're not in direct competition. So, I mean, it's possible other promoters go the UBO route, but they're going to be at a great disadvantage if they do that, because TKO, Zuffa Boxing already has the leg up on that whole thing.
And no, one thing I wanted to ask you too is, obviously, um, there's this is very polarizing legislation. Obviously, there are some proponents who just rave about it, and then there are a lot of people who kind of, such as yourself, or who've read your reporting and really understand another reporting like that, and really understand kind of the ramifications could be maybe negative for a lot of people involved in this who are not, the ones from the top down. Um, is there anything in this bill that maybe anyone can actually agree is actually positive for everybody, or is that really not the case here?
No, I mean, there's a lot in the bill I like. I would not complain. The
Mhm.
$200 minimum for boxers, great. I mean, I don't think there's many boxers that actually make, based on reported payouts from the state athletic commissions, it's a small percentage of boxers that make $200 a round or less. Less is about 10%, according to the reported payouts. Now, the problem with the reported payouts, often those boxers are working a commission. They have to sell tickets to get their purse. Does this $200 around minimum, is that above and beyond the commission, or are those commission consignment type purse structures still going to be allowed? So I don't, but the $200 minimum, I don't think many people are complaining against. Increasing insurance, I mean, 50,000 might be a hard bill to cover for some states, smaller club shows. But overall, it's good to increase the insurance. It gets rid of some of the fly by night type organizations that aren't, that are just putting on. I don't want to be mean, but derogatory, but bum fights. Some people just kind of put on, any guy they can get off the street, so we can get rid of some of them. I have no problem with that. Those are good, and some of the sanctioning organization regulations I don't have a problem with. I think it's kind of nice that the ABC could have done this years ago, but it's nice to enforce an act that says you can't have more than one title per weight class, one championship. Limiting the rules about when an interim can be issued. I like that they limit the type of compensation beyond the fees that sanction organizations get. Those are good. I like that they say that the athletic commission has to assign the judges and referees to matches, and sanction organizations can't do it. Those are great. Those are the type of stuff I like. The problem I have, it all seems kind of like a Trojan horse. It's been designed to smuggle in this UBO model, and I know a lot of people are like, "Oh, it's an option," but it's not really. I mean, again, when people say, "Oh, fighters will have a choice," well, if they're able to engage in coercive contracts, I mean, the definition of a coercive contract is you're not giving someone a choice. And so I don't quite buy the defense of the current bill that all fighters are just given an option, a choice. It's some ways it's like if you gave businesses an option between following labor law and another business the right to waive any of the protections that they have to follow. A lot of businesses are going to change the second, and a lot of workers are still going to end up going to work for them because they, depending on their current situation, that might be the best option. But long term, is it great not having labor protections where you're at? I don't think so.
I
Sure,
think you've
sure.
answered most of my questions, Scott. I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, yeah. I've still got a few. I mean, you're so knowledgeable and you're so able to dive deep into this, and you did a really great job of that, I think, in your piece for the Uncrowned this week as well, which I would point people toward reading for even further depth in terms of that. But one thing I'm curious about too still is obviously this is U.S. legislation, and boxing certainly happens globally. So what is the effect on global boxing?
Well, I mean, it doesn't impact global boxing per se, except for the fact that traditionally the United States has been the biggest market with the most number of champions. And so the most amount of business is done in the United States. So that had an outside influence on the rest of the world. Again, I mean, it's interesting to note in the 90s, there was tons of use of option clauses. And some of them are still used. And, I have some people on Twitter, oh, this is used in the UK. This would break the Ali Act. How good is the Ali Act that they can do this in the UK? Oh yeah, they violate it sometimes in other countries. They don't follow it, and in the United States they don't follow it all the time too. But I mean, one of the hilarious things is back in the 90s, the original Ben versus Eubank fight, Don King had a provision in that. He had a winner take all clause. And that winner all take all clause was that whoever wins the match is not even whoever wins or loses the match, the winner and the loser both have to sign with him long term, right? And you don't see clauses like that. Now, what's hilarious is that because that bout ended in a draw in '93, their second fight, guess what? Don King was screwed and got no options on either of them. He only put it winner or loser. So that's the type of provisions they could put in back then. And in the UK, because even American promoters had such influence, they could force that onto the UK, other spots. The same with the WBC used to have a champions provision, basically that would compel, boxers to sign with Don King. That was removed, and that protects fighters outside the United States as well. So, yes, promotions outside the US are free not to follow the Ali Act at all, but it does seem like the history of the business and the history of a lot of regulations are when America does something because of our size, because of our influence, it has a spillover effect, and other places kind of follow along just to be in compliant with American rules.
Interesting. I mean, that makes sense too. So, and another question I have too, this is a little bit more unrelated because I'm curious if there is any effect that this is boxing legislation. Is there any sort of ripple effect into other combat sports, particularly mixed martial arts?
Well, it's hard to tell except for mixed martial arts. It's hard to me to discuss the other sports because they are so small, especially in the American landscape. I mean, and then people bring up pro wrestling, but pro wrestling, as much as it's very similar, it's fake. I mean, it's a performance, which is the one thing that really separates it. Even though it's structured the same, it's the aesthetic appearance of a combat sport, but again, it's performative, so it doesn't really apply. But in that mixed martial arts, I think there is a lot of ripple effects. One is, and it's funny, a lot of the supporters, I won't name names, but supporters in the Association of Professional Boxing Commissions point out that, that regulations that apply to boxers end up applying to MMA fighters, so this will help them. And I'm thinking, no, they don't. There's many regulations that were called for under the original Muhammad Ali Reform Boxing Act that never applied to MMA. So it doesn't get applied universally to MMA fighters. So that's one. The second thing I would say is that the goal of many people in the Mixed Martial Arts Fighters Association and others was always to expand the Ali Act to cover mixed martial arts as a way to give more leverage, create more competition in MMA. If this passes, that objective is destroyed. That that goal can no longer would be worthwhile to expand the Ali Act because the whole intent was to separate titles from the promoter. That's why they wanted to do it, so that fighters would have more leverage. Well, now under this UBO structure, the UFC would automatically be compliant, and so there's no reason now to expand the Ali Act to MMA. And finally, I think this could have an impact on the UFC's antitrust cases, because specifically the Davis v. Zuffa case, where Phil Davis is the named plaintiff. He is trying to get a class action he's filed a complaint. They're seeking class action status. And he represents fighters outside the UFC. They're not asking for any damages. They're just asking for injunctive relief. But that complaint uses extensive use of the legislative history of boxing, namely the Muhammad Ali Reform Boxing Act, discusses the intent, how these actions were viewed as actions that lead to monopolization. And so they're using that as their evidence in their case. Well, if this bill passes, I'm not sure how effective a case that cites what's considered legal, federally accepted practices in boxing is going to be within their case now. How effective is it going to be to point out practices that you claim lead to monopolization, but the federal government now says are wholly acceptable practices under our federal laws?
So is there anything stopping this legislation at this point? It seems like an inevitability, but is there anything that can, like, Hail Mary, change the course of this at this point?
Well, I mean, I would still favor it's going to pass. I think they're going to run up to a harder fight in the Senate. I've talked to people, I've heard from people that there are efforts underway to put up, I think some people have finally woken up, and some people have become aware, some Democrats even, that, those that supported the bill are now, like, I think they realize they don't know what they were doing. They don't know what they're voting for. They just voted for it because lobbyists told them to, and there was no pushback. But now there's some pushback. There's some contact. The question is, will they get enough Democrat? It's going to be Democrats because basically every senator on the GOP side is going to vote for it because Donald Trump his administration wants to see this passed. You got to remember, people in his administration used to work for the UFC, and he was represented by Ari Emanuel, and he's good friends with Dana White. So, and it's the Trump administration; they'll sell anything out. So it's given that the GOP is going to vote for it. But so the question is, can they get enough Democrats to block it? I think there's a better chance than in the House, but we'll have to see. The other thing we could wait and see is, a lot of shit keeps springing up in U.S. politics. I mean, we have a war in Iran, we have Epstein files coming out. You never know what's going to derail a vote, and so I do think there's a possibility that something derails the vote because something super important springs up and they cannot fit it in. In many ways, that's what happened to the bill in the House. It was supposed to be voted on much earlier. They originally had a date like November 5th for the first hearing, and it'd be postponed for a month. Why? Because they had a government shutdown. Then there was, they never didn't want to go back and reopen government because they didn't want to release the Epstein files. So things can end up derailing legislation, and it's possible the same thing happens in the Senate. But I got a feeling they're going to put a lot of pressure on Ted Cruz and other Republicans to try to guide this through the Senate as quick as possible.
Nah, but you're talking about a potential situation here where that actually does get shot down, but we still have Zuffa Boxing, by all appearances, operating currently as if this is already passed. What happens to the way they've been operating? Am I right? Are they operating that way, or is there some way that they're still compliant as of right now?
Well, they are operating in some ways. They're not doing full UBO system, but they issued their own title, which they claim is a course of contract violation. They've had people like Shapiro and Epstein and stuff talk in interviews and mention, and behind the scenes talk about the reason they want to pass is just to make sure they don't have future problems. Because I think, what people miss is the Ollie Act, the original bill, was never enforced by the government. The states never enforced it. The Attorney General and the federal government never enforced it. Who enforces the original Ollie Act are the boxers themselves. It includes a provision in there that allows for a right of private action. The right to private action, the boxer himself can go to federal court and sue for Ollie Act violations. And so he doesn't have to count on government regulators to do it for him. They have the right to do it themselves. That's the tool that's enforced the Ollie Act. That's the only way it's ever been enforced. That's would be lost under the UBO structure. And so I think TKO's fear is, the reason they can have this title right now is the only one that can challenge the title, the only one that can bring a complaint forward. Well, I guess the Attorney General could, but do you really think Pam Bondi of the Trump administration is going to bring a complaint forward? I don't think so. So the only one who could bring a complaint forward are the boxers. And right now, I don't think Jay Opatai is going to be offended by it, and other boxers. But their fear's got to be down the line that some boxer eventually is going to file a complaint, and they're going to lose if they do not have the protections of the UBO. I think that's their concern. And right now, I know some people are complaining about Zuffa Boxing getting into the space. I have no problem. I mean, I think it's going to be great for boxers in the short run because they are going to pay a ton of money. I mean, they themselves might not, but the Saudi investors behind them are going to pay a ton of money to a bunch of boxers. The second, third tier guys that are signing up for the regular Zuffa Boxing events are going to make more than they would on regular club shows. So that's new money being injected. The concern I have is not Zuffa Boxing trying to make a boxing promotion. It's Zuffa Boxing getting a UBO in place. And then down the line, we find ourselves in the nightmare scenario that they've recreated the International Boxing Club of New York.
Interesting. I think that pretty much does it for me, John. And you've been so helpful in this. I think we went way over the time that we had discussed, so I appreciate you being patient with us and taking the time to discuss all this. I know it's a passion topic for you as well, though. So this isn't so hard for you, right?
Well, I wouldn't say passion project. But I'm so used to talking about it. It's one of those subjects that I don't think it's funny. For years, no one had interest in this. I'm the only one. Me and maybe two other people were interested in this subject, and now it's like, wow, that kind of paid off. Finally, there's something I can talk about because it's come back. It's come back around. This antitrust history of boxing is now making the rounds again. Look at that.
Absolutely.
History repeats itself, right?
Yeah, it's a loop. It's a circle.
Thank you so much for your time, John, and for your offering your experience. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me
Thank you.
on.
Keep up the good work.
Alrighty.
Thank you guys.
Thank you, John. Have a good one. Alrighty, want to thank John again for coming on and breaking this all down. It's a very meaty topic, and it's got a lot of stuff going on, so we appreciate him coming on, and definitely go read his piece over at Uncrowned if you haven't already. But Scott, we got a lot to talk about as far as fights go, don't we?
We do. It's a little packed. We're gonna try and cram it in here as best we can, right?
Yes, we are. And let us know in the comments what you thought about our conversation with John. But let's talk this weekend. Israel Adesanya and Joe Pyfer are going to be throwing down in Seattle for UFC Seattle, and that's going to be Saturday, 8 p.m. Main card, 5 p.m. prelims, all on Paramount Plus. And Scott, I think it's fair to say in Adesanya's last few fights, he's on a little bit of a skid, that he's lost a step. I just want to ask you, how much of a step do you think he's lost? I guess that's my main question here.
Yeah, I think has he lost a step at 36? By now he's 36. He'll be 37 in the summer. Yeah, I think it's fair to say he's lost at least some sort of a step, but I don't know how much he really has in the grand scheme of it. We don't have him in our top 10 in our global MMA rankings right now, but that's really more of a byproduct of the stipulations we put in place. If a fighter's lost 3 fights in a row, they're ineligible. He's lost 3 fights in a row. Those 3 fights have come against all the fighters after the champion in our top 4. So we're talking about somebody who realistically, if there's anyone who's omitted from our rankings that I kind of feel bad about omitting, it's probably him because he ought to be like the number 5 guy, like definitively right now. And if he goes out there and he looks good against Joe Pyfer and he gets a win, I think I'm probably unanimously all 3 of us are going to slot him at number 5 when he comes back in those rankings. But as far as how much of a step he's lost, I mean, there's at least a little bit, right, Jake? There's speed was one of his weapons, and we're starting to see that go away just a little bit with age.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's unfortunate in his last fight it ended the way it did with the eye poke. I mean, he was looking good, I think, so far in that Nasruddin Imavov fight, but that's the first thing that goes is the speed. I'm just curious to see this layoff and the layoff he had before that. It's just a lot of time, not in the octagon that we haven't seen. So I'm very curious to see what he looks like there, but there's no way it's helped in terms of the timeline.
I would argue that the time he's taken off, though, especially coming off of, some finishes and stuff, I think that can only be a good thing for him. I think it's going to give his brain a bit of a break. It's going to hopefully make him potentially a little more capable of taking some of those shots he's proved a little less capable of taking. Nasruddin Imavov finishes him off. Dricus du Plessis, obviously he finishes him as well. It was a little different, but it's interesting. I think that he's got this time. He did take the time. He was patient with himself. Now he comes back here, and obviously Pyfer hits hard, but at the same time, like when you look at his results over these last 5 fights, he's 1-4 in his last 5. They're all, if not championship fights, they're against elite contenders, right? We're talking about the 3 fights that I mentioned against the 2, 3, and 4 in our middleweight division. Also, the who just vacated without losing the light heavyweight title could become the interim heavyweight champion, Alex Pereira. He went 1-1 in those fights. But if you look at all 5 of those fights, he's got 14 rounds completed. So that ignores the rounds where he was finished in, right? Or got a finish, as was the case as well. In those fights, 14 rounds completed. He won 8 of them against all those guys, and he lost 4 of those 6 rounds that he lost to Strickland in one fight. So we're talking about somebody who, yes, he's getting finished. He's also winning fights. So if he can make the fight go the distance, you got to feel a lot of confidence in him against probably anybody on the planet, and he still has finishing ability too.
That is true, and I definitely agree in terms of what you're saying about the time off. There was that stretch. He was one of the more active champions that I've seen in my time watching this sport. And that's a very good point. Like I mentioned before, like he was looking good against Nasruddin and until he didn't. He was looking good against Dricus and until he didn't. So
It was competitive, but yes, absolutely. I think he won rounds 1 and 3. They were split, right? There was a judge who gave Dricus each of those rounds, but 2 out of 3 gave Israel those rounds, so he wins those rounds. He was certainly in that fight. It was starting to head in a little bit of a different direction, and then he obviously got finished. But what we're seeing here is this is not somebody who's starting to get the doors blown off him yet, save for the Strickland fight, and that who knows how a rematch could go in that one. I'd be curious.
yeah, I think I would definitely be willing to watch that one again. But I want to talk about Mr. Joe Pyfer too, who's going to be standing on the other side of the cage. This is inarguably, I would say, a step up in competition. Do you think he's ready for this big step up?
It's a big jump, and it feels too big to me, as far as the matchmaking goes. For him, it's high upside, really low downside here, because if he loses to Israel Adesanya, one of the greatest middleweights we've ever seen, who's still not that far removed from that, I don't think. It's not that big a deal, but, he's looked good in these last few fights, coming off of the Jack Hermanson loss a couple years ago. He's improved, I think, and he realistically should be fighting top 10 level fighters. I think Adesanya just feels like a touch higher. I would have said somebody like maybe like if I was matchmaking, maybe more of a Jared Cannonier, which I think would have been a fun fight. I think it would have been a little more of a okay, let's see where is he at in the next step. But part of this is, hey, let's see if what we have in Joe Pyfer, and part of it is, hey, maybe we could see if Israel Adesanya can get right here too. I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm very curious how this goes. I wouldn't rule out Pyfer. I do kind of look at Adesanya here as he really ought to still win this fight.
Yeah, fair enough. I will say when this fight was first announced, I was surprised because Izzy's a big name. Izzy's a big name. I was surprised that Joe Pyfer was the person that they picked. He doesn't have too many fights left, Izzy, right? I was a little bit surprised that it was him that they decided to put up against him. Were you also? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I said, I would have gone somewhere different. I think with Adesanya as well. I think if let's say they went with Nasruddin Imavov again, getting the title shot instead of Sean Strickland. I think you absolutely could have done a Strickland Adesanya rematch, and that would have been something that realistically could either anchor its own card, like a fight night like this, and probably to an even higher degree in terms of drawing power. Or you put it on a pay-per-view and you start really stacking it out with, oh my gosh, look at this. It's a title rematch of these two guys. It's gonna do gangbusters too. So I'm a little surprised, but hey, we are where we are, and I am interested in it. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that it goes either way.
Yes, surprising, but I think once we heard it, we were like, yeah, okay, I see what you're going for here. It's interesting. But Scott, let's talk about some of the other fights on this card going on in Seattle. What is your fight to watch?
I'm gonna highlight Macy Barber against Alexa Grasso just because I think it's an important fight that we're not really gonna dive too deep into. It's a rematch, right? We're talking about an interesting situation here too because we have Grasso outside of our top 10 because she's 0-2-1 in her last 3 fights. By default, she's not eligible for our rankings, but realistically, she would be in there as well. So she goes out there, she gets a win. She's right back in the mix at least a little bit. I think she's still got work to do because of some of the, losing to Natalia Silva. That puts her behind there as well. Barber, on the other hand, though, this is another chance for her to get further away from that very unfortunate situation where she was not able to make the walk last minute against Aaron Blanchfield, had a medical episode. The further she can get away from that, the more she can put on impressive performances, the better it is for her. I still would be surprised if she was able to crash the title picture ahead of Aaron Blanchfield, given the way that all worked out. And it wouldn't, I don't think it would sit right with anybody if that happened, but who knows? There's a lot of intrigue here, and I'm curious how this fight's going to go.
Absolutely, some big stakes there. And for Eric's fight, he's got Ignacio Bahamondes. This is someone that he definitely has his eye on pretty often, and he's going against Tofik Musayev. I hope I got that one right.
I think you did, yeah.
All right. And then for me, I've got to go with Mr. T-Rex, who's going up against Kyle Nelson. I'm looking at his topology just to double check, but I'm quite positive he's never seen the scorecards in the UFC, at least. His last 7 fights, finishing in the first round, live by the sword, die by the sword. So if it goes anything like it has been, this fight should be an interesting one.
And he's a Washington guy, so he's fighting close to home. I think that's going to be key for him. I think he'll be energized.
Absolutely. And Scott, what do we have for our event rating in Seattle?
This is a 57. It's right up there with that Houston event last month, the fight night that was headlined by Sean Strickland. Powered by a strong main co-main combo here, and it's got a ton of depth. There's only 2 fighters out of 26 on this card who are ranked outside the top 90 even. And one of those, it may surprise you, is Terrence McKinney, actually, he's just not, he's like number 149 or something like that. He can't get the wins together against the right people, but he's entertaining nonetheless, right?
Yes.
10 of the fighters are on this card are top 26 in their weight class. Half of those, I should point out, are from women's 115 or 25. I'm not sure what that says for some people who just are starting to head towards not liking women's MMA, but these are top women. You can't deny that. And honestly, it's headlined too by the full bore top 10 fight between Barber and Grasso. I really like this card in terms of talent on display. I think it's a nicely built card. It's a good one to take on the road to Seattle.
I agree. And as far as what we would typically have as 3 bets in 3 minutes, obviously Eric is not here. However, he was on a winning week last week. He hit 2 of the 3 fights that he bet on. So let's go, Eric. And let's keep it on UFC for now. We'll get to PFL in a little bit. Let's talk about what happened this past weekend. Massive stakes at featherweight and implications. Movsar Evloev tops Lerone Murphy via decision. And let's start with Evloev, because in this fight, he did not look like he normally does. He comes out striking for quite a while and then finally works in the grappling in there. It almost looked like that was something that was intentional because of what's been going on in the conversations around him not getting a title shot with his style that he's been having. So I got to ask you, fighters of his caliber, do you think that they will need to change their style like it kind of looked like Movsar did to get a title shot that they deserve?
I think unfortunately they may have to in some way if they want to get what they want, which would be the UFC champion and to fight for that UFC title. It's hard to look at the Murphy fight as anything other than him absolutely doing that, just going out there and changing his style completely in a way that's meant to at least be more in your face and active and entertain, for better or worse. I mean, there's something to be said for that. I thought he actually had a pretty good performance on the whole, so maybe it brought out a little more of the best of him in and of itself. But a few things I want to point out here too that are kind of ancillary to the question, right? Evloev's case is so extreme because that win made him the only fighter in UFC history to win 10 fights in a row without finishing anyone among them, extending his own record in the process. So he is a total unicorn in terms of that. If he could have gone out there and finished even one of the earlier fights he had in the UFC, I think we're talking about a different situation than what we have, because the narrative really around that is not very strong. And it's frankly, there is entertainment factor to be had here. And like John is saying, or has said in some of his in his writing as well, the rankings are not determined by any sort of sanctioning body. The UFC decides who gets these title fights. So like it or not, they do unfortunately have to operate within that structure. There's also the fact that I just don't see that many other elite fighters who are going to have to deal with the same kind of changing of their style that Evloev did. Most other top fighters have at least shown some ability to finish. They've shown that they're willing to kind of mix it up. They'll have a good fight in there here and there that can at least sate, the masses. We've got Arman Tsarukyan. He didn't get his title shot that, we kind of all feel he basically deserves. He had one a year and a half ago, and he missed out on that for his own purposes. But that's a different thing than his in-cage, fights. When he fights, he's fun to watch. He's usually generally engaging more or less. And the other thing I would say is this will sort of take care of itself. If people see this, coaches see this, they're going to work with the young fighters. They're going to try to bring that out of them. We've even seen Khabib noting this as well. Like, you guys are going to have to fight with a little more entertainment, a little more action. You can't just take it down and be on top. You'll win fights, but it's not going to be the thing that brings you to the promised land, the top that you're trying to get to. So there's probably just going to be adjustments along the way. And I think that's probably what we'll see. What do you think, Jake? Am I crazy or what?
No, I don't think you're crazy, because the thing is that, like you said, it's the fact that Movsar just hasn't gotten any finishes with this style. It's a compounding of the two, right? It's the style and the not getting any finishes, or I guess showing more aggression to try and look for the finishes, right? Someone like Khabib, he had suffocating grappling, and that was his game, but he was finishing
And he
people.
mixed in some really heavy ground and pound too. This was a violent type of fighter on the ground in a way that Evloev never really revealed himself to be yet.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and while he looked very good against Lerone Murphy in that fourth and fifth round, I'm curious to see what would have happened if he just stuck to that game plan for the entire time over the course of 5 rounds. Like maybe he actually could have gotten a finish had he just stuck with that game plan from the get go. But I don't know if that's what the UFC was looking for.
No,
So
probably not. But I will say, at the very least, I think he actually did look pretty good out there. His striking is not like it's
surprised me.
not impressive, but it's solid. And I think I even alluded to that last week. He's got some striking here. It was even better than I really expected it to be for a fight that especially was mostly fought at distance on the feet. And it's not flashy, but it got the job done. And if he can do that more often, there's fighters it's not going to work against. That's when you go to your ground game, and he has that in his pocket. It's something he can pull out on just about everybody we've seen so far. Can he do it against the champion if he gets that opportunity? I don't know. He should though. He absolutely needs to get that opportunity next.
Yeah, well, we will see what happens there. But Scott, you are someone who I would say is a pretty big expert when it comes to scoring. And after this fight ended, I was very surprised. Perhaps something to do with the commentary might have played a little bit into that. But I thought that Lerone Murphy had won the fight, especially with that point being taken away in it was third or fourth round. Excuse me for forgetting, but the point
Fourth
taken
round.
away in the fourth round. And Scott, not everyone has a Scott to text right after they've watched a fight. So for those who don't, could you please help me understand the decision that they came to?
So I'll tell you full disclosure, I did have Murphy up 30 to 27 after 3 rounds, but I also did acknowledge at the same time I thought 2 and 3 were possibilities for Evloev. So, when I heard 48-46, I figured it was Murphy like I had it, but at the same time, it didn't stun me that it went the other way because those 2 rounds could have gone that way. The real surprise for me was that it actually was the first round that went unanimous for Evloev. And I made sure to go back and watch it. I whenever I don't meet the judging of a fight to such a high degree where they're all one way and I'm the other way. I rather than me being like, oh, the judges are crazy, I try to go the other way and say, well, why is it that way? Am I like where am I potentially off base? So I go back and I watch it and I say, okay, you know what? I think actually Evloev was probably more effective with his striking. It was much easier to see round one for him in particular. Round three, I think I was able to come off of inside the other way, but we're still talking about a close round here, and I still feel pretty good about my Murphy score for round two. But at the end of the day, I think we're still talking about a fight that, hey, those first 3 rounds were at least closer. They were more competitive, and then rounds 4 and 5, despite the loss of a point in round four, and a justified one, I want to point out. Mark Goddard taking the point for the second low blow, loved it. More of it, please. That you got to take points there, and so that was the right way to do it. Despite that, yeah, I'm not surprised that we saw a fight that was much clearer for Evloev later on go his way, and was a little more mixed in the beginning. And I think ultimately he did have the better fight.
Yeah, I was just so convinced from listening to the broadcast that over and so confident that it was 30-27. And I know that is what you had, but you'll be the first one to say, if it's a close fight, like you can't call something a robbery when it's that close. The judges might be seeing things that you're not back home, and definitely they're not
Or
hearing things.
hearing.
Yeah, exactly. In
And
pre-production,
not hearing exactly, yeah, you're alluding to kind of there was a commentary slant here, right? And I think I fell
100%.
victim to it, to be perfectly honest. You have especially Michael Bisping, the Brit, certainly pushing it in the direction of his countryman, Lerone Murphy, here on friendly soil. I'm sure there's at least to some degree that was it intentional? I don't know that it was. I think sometimes you just can't help it, especially these guys. They're not paid to do down the middle. They're paid to be Michael Bisping or Daniel Cormier or whoever they are, right? It just so happens it went that way here. I think that ultimately the right guy won, and that really is okay with me. And yeah, I think it's just one of those things that you got to keep in mind, especially if you're ever curious to watch a fight back. This is the advice I'd like to give. If you're ever curious to watch a fight back, or you really just want to watch it with the scoring in mind, you don't want to be poisoned by the well of maybe the commentary there, watch it in a language you don't understand. I could watch it in Spanish. I could watch it in Portuguese, and I'll hear the fight, and I'll hear people talking about it, and I'll have no idea what they're saying, but I can figure out what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do like what you said in terms of the right man won. Even if, let's just say, we were sitting here right now, the way that the fight went, being like, yeah, Lerone, deserved to win that one, at least on the scorecards. With what I saw in that fourth and fifth round from Movsar doing what he should have done, he looked to me like the better fighter. If that does that make any sense? Sort of what I'm getting at
No,
here.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally get it. Yeah.
So I think that wraps up for UFC London. Unless you got anything else, Scott, do you want to move on to PFL?
I think we got to cram it in. We went a little over our time with John there, so we've got to get to some of this stuff. And that was great as it was. I would rather
Yes.
have our time with John, to be perfectly honest.
Yes. Alrighty. So let's just quickly go over UFC. Let's quickly go over PFL. Let's get out of here. As far as the preview, what happened last weekend, Costello Vansteen's a lot of stuff going on at middleweight these 2 weekends in a row. He goes ahead and finishes Fabian Edwards, some elbow strikes. I got to ask you, in his performance, what do you think this does for his position as a PFL champion and his standings in the global middleweight picture?
I think it's sort of like solidified that he belongs, given that it was a bit of a stunner that he beat Johnny Eblen last summer, both in the comeback nature of it and the fact that he really was not a very highly regarded middleweight to that point. He was a little out of the blue there. Not necessarily as a challenger. I think there was only so many people they could be fighting, but that was what it was, right? He goes out there and he beats Fabian Edwards, who looked good throughout PFL's tournament last year at middleweight. And not only did he beat him, I mean, CVS, he was kind of all over him for basically that entire fight. I think he demands to be taken seriously at 185 now. And this I think was a best case scenario for CVS. Not just he wins and he wins on his home soil in Madrid and Spain, but also he really beat somebody who everybody kind of regarded. I had Fabian Edwards in my top 10. He will fall out now. But that was a big win.
Absolutely. And I think just to put a bow on that, he won that last fight against Johnny Eblen in what some people might have mischaracterized as like a lucky submission at the end. Maybe they didn't watch, the whole thing through. This just he beat a top middleweight in the division. He belongs there, essentially.
He's
But
now beaten two of them. You can say what you want about it, but he's beaten two in a row. If you're not taking him seriously, then I think you're not being fair to Costello Vansteenis.
absolutely. And let's talk about the former champion who's going to be fighting this weekend in Pittsburgh. Finally, the PFL is coming back stateside. They've been doing a lot of stuff over Europe, obviously, in Madrid last weekend, but he's taking on Brian Battle in Pittsburgh. I got to ask you, is this the right fight for Eblen since he's looking to become champion again? He's going up against Brian Battle, who's new to the PFL. What do you think?
Before I even say it, I just want to point out the fact that not only does this card overlap the UFC card, it actually starts a little later, and the main card is on ESPN2. It is actually on a real channel and not just a streaming service. The prelims are ESPN Plus, so that's 10 p.m. main card, 7 p.m. prelims. But as far as this fight, I do think it's a weird one, right? I can't sugarcoat it. Brian Battle is a very tough guy, and he was making moves up the board at 170 in the UFC before his complete lack of weight discipline torpedoed that run, right? But one blessing of the matchup here, at least if for Eblen's case, is let's say he wins. Let's game this out. Let's say he wins this fight. No guarantee. He wins this fight. He happens to go on and win that title back from Costello Vansteenis. They can either do a trilogy fight right away, which maybe they will, maybe they won't. But it also doesn't take away from other, common sense, fresh opponents. Somebody like a Dalton Rasta, for example, who's also fighting on the undercard here. He's fighting Impa Kasanganay. Even if Kasanganay were to win, and they said they wanted to do that rematch, that was a 3-round fight, and it was pretty competitive. So you can do a 5-round fight, and it makes a lot more sense for Eblen here. So it almost takes some of their more preferred options and pushes them down the road, which, last week I certainly wasn't happy with them doing that in terms of not just doing Eblin versus CVS right away. But also, I think they can do stuff with Brian Battle. People talk about Brian Battle. I thought I saw someone on social media, or maybe it was on one of the websites. It was they were highlighting him as somebody who tends to fall upward. He's in a main event here, and then he got cast out of the UFC. So people talk about him for better or worse. And if he wins this fight, even then PFL's got somebody else they'll talk about even more.
Yeah, hopefully he can make weight. I think that's
That
another.
would be nice.
Yeah, that would
There's
be.
no guarantee, but Eblin said he's taking the fight either way. He's not going to pass up the fight. If he misses weight, I mean, he'll deal with that, but he's going to take the fight.
Yeah, absolute gamer. If you guys haven't seen Scott's interview with Johnny Eblin, go ahead and check that out. But Scott, another event rating. What do we have for PFL Pittsburgh?
We've gotten 11, so this is actually on basically the same level as UFC London last week for context. Pretty solid PFL main event and co-main. I told you, the main obviously, and I mentioned Impa Kasanganay and Dalton Rasta. That's the co-main. That's another top 30 middleweight fight. 9 of the 24 fighters on this card are top 100, and that includes Natan Schultz, who actually is technically not ranked with Fight Matrix where I pulled these from, but his last ranking, he hasn't fought in 3 years. He was on a 4-fight win streak. His last ranking was 16. So I go by that when we're factoring this in. Still somebody who's an elite type fighter. We'll see if he brings that back. But I mean, there's fights here on the prelims to watch. Last week it was kind of barren, and I think here you could absolutely tune into those ESPN Plus prelims for PFL, and there will be some real worthy fights to check out.
Absolutely. And there's also a lot else going on in the world of PFL. Scott, why don't you break some of that down for us in quick hits?
Jake, we have a jam-packed edition of quick hits this week. There were so many that I just kind of felt I couldn't cut. So I actually want to start at PFL to kind of keep PFL going. Their CEO, John Martin, suggested on the Ariel Helwani show that they are maybe considering a rebrand, potentially including a new name and logo. So, that continues. Obviously, we're seeing a new era of PFL. Maybe we'll just see a brand new, as I drop my earbud here. Maybe we'll see a brand new entity in and of itself. Not the first time World Series of Fighting became something different. So, so there's that. But separately, Martin also announced that, and unfortunate news, Paul Hughes has been forced out of the headliner he was going to be in at PFL Belfast in front of the Irish people. That is not going to be happening for him. A knee injury has failed him. He's going to be having surgery. He has later clarified on social media. So the new April 16 main event still in Belfast. Original opponent JJ Wilson is going against Dara Kelly. That is still a lightweight fight. Switching over to the UFC and many business over there, Dana White has refuted manager Ali Abdelaziz claims to TMZ that Islam Makhachev is going to defend his title in July. White is saying on Instagram that the welterweight champion would be fighting in August. So yeah, keep your eye out for that. Maybe we'll get something more clear about that shortly. Maybe not. Who knows what their schedule is, right? We'll just hear from Dana White one day. It'll happen. Uh, Manel Kape versus Kyoji Horiguchi is a now reported main event that is coming to the Apex on June 20th. That's an important flyweight fight. No confirmation yet, but let's take that as pretty much happening, I would imagine. Interesting, outside of the UFC, but sort of related, Georges St-Pierre, there is going to be a biopic in development for one of the greatest fighters of all time. My money, the greatest fighter of all time. This was as reported by Variety. Fellow Quebecois Thomas Soto is attached to direct. There are no real details other than that right now. So very early in development, it sounds like. Former UFC heavyweight champion Brock Lesnar spoke with the Spit and Chicklets podcast, a hockey podcast. He's a hockey dad, about the genesis of his UFC run, among other things. And I thought this was interesting. He revealed that Dana White, quote, wouldn't return my calls at first. So who knows what would have happened if Dana just never spoke to Brock Lesnar. Maybe I'm not even talking about this sport because that was something that got me pretty interested. The fact that he was crossing over into this land. Another UFC thing before we kind of dip out to one more. Dana White Contender Series winner and UFC signee Levy Rodriguez Jr. has been suspended 9 months by the Nevada State Athletic Commission over a positive test for a metabolite. of the anabolic steroid nandrolone. So he will have to wait for his UFC debut. And finally, MVP MMA has filled out their undercard just about entirely for their Netflix event on May 16th. Couple highlights I wanted to give you here. Mohamed Mokaev, who I thought was going to be on this card, turns out he is, against an opponent I did not see coming, Adriano Moraes, at a flyweight fight, which we'll see if Moraes makes flyweight, and Junior Dos Santos, former UFC heavyweight champion, going against Robeles de Spain. That's a heavyweight fight, of course, and Despain, of course, had kind of washed out of the UFC, kind of had no wrestling. Maybe we'll see something different and more exciting play out against JDS. And that is your quick hits.
Alrighty, thank you so much for that very comprehensive list of quick hits. But Scott, let's talk about our homework that we watched for this week. Dan Hardy versus Carlos Condit at UFC 120 2010. Mohawk Dan Hardy. I think this might have been the first fight that I've actually seen of Dan Hardy. I'm obviously aware that he had the Mohawk, but it's just kind of interesting seeing him in a suit and all that today. And then,
well, yeah. I mean, I guess his whole identity was that Mohawk for a long time, and then he's so far removed from that for viewers like yourself that it's like you don't even think of him that way anymore. It's probably like it's almost weird for me to imagine that.
Yeah, I remember when we met him actually in New York after that PFL event. It's like crazy seeing the contrast from then and now, just like on appearance. But
it's a whole nother life.
Absolutely.
It was another life ago. But the fight itself, dude.
Yeah,
what do you think?
The fight itself, a lot going on, and especially in the second half of the first round, they kind of opened up a lot of kicks going on, and then they really started kind of letting the hands fly. I want to say probably about halfway through into the round with some pretty serious intent to put either guy away, and it just happened where it's funny, they're talking about the left hooks from Dan Hardy, and it's like, oh, there it goes again, and then they both throw a left hook, and Carlos was the one who ended up landing it and sleep.
This fight is known for the double hook. It's all about who landed it first, and Carlos Condit's case, he was able to get there just a touch sooner. Does Dan Hardy's hook floor Carlos Condit? I don't know, but it certainly looked like it had the same type of intentions there, and that would have been really interesting to see. But one thing that I remember this fight in particular for, and I don't think they even drew much attention to it in the video that we watched, because I watched it on Fight Pass, you watched it on Fight Pass. You can see in the background the only person who just jumps out of his seat the moment that this thing lands is Robert Downey Jr., who was watching this fight with I want to say his co-stars and director from Sherlock Holmes. So it would have been Guy Ritchie and maybe Jude Law or something like that. So he's the American in the UK for this fight. Funny. And the American drops him and he immediately leaps out of his seat. If you go back and watch, you can see it. There's certain angles. He's wearing like a red shirt. And that was kind of, that got a little bit of a play in the coming days. It was a lot of fun. It added something to that fight.
That's awesome. This was in England, right? Bisping was at the top of the card.
Yes, it was. It was in the UK. Absolutely. This was a fun fight, and I picked this because it was one of my most favorite fights that happened in the UK while we were watching a UK fight over the weekend.
I see where you're going with this. Okay, very nice.
Well, thematic.
Yeah, let us know in the comment. You are thematic. You don't get enough credit for that. Let us know in the comments what you guys thought of your homework. And as speaking of homework, Scott, what do we have coming up?
Got a double feature coming at you. It is the Korean Zombie 2011 double feature. That is his rematch against Leonard Garcia and his fight against Mark Hominick. These were Chan Sung Jung's first two fights in the UFC after starting out in WEC. WEC gets absorbed in full in 2011. So these were, again, his first two fights out there. The Garcia fight was, of course, a heavily anticipated rematch from their all-time brawl, which is only 11 months earlier. They put that together pretty quickly. And then Hominick, he was coming off for their fight, being the first UFC featherweight title challenger just 8 months earlier, had lost to Jose Aldo in that one.
All right. I mean, Korean Zombie, never a boring guy, so very excited about that. But Scott, wrapping up our history of MMA, what happened this week in MMA?
We're going to go back to this exact date, 15 years ago, March 26, 2011. UFC makes its first visit to Seattle, where they are this weekend. How about that?
Oh my goodness. There's that theme again.
And actually the Garcia versus Zombie 2 fight was on that card. That was at least part of why I ended up picking that fight. Lot of high level fighters on this card. This was like throwback to when some of the cards were just amazing from fight night perspectives. Headliner was Little Nog Antonio Nogueira against Phil Davis, who you mentioned we had John mentioned earlier is a plaintiff against the UFC right now. Lots of change in 15 years.
So much themes.
Yeah, so many themes. It's all. I mean, we didn't plan that with John. It just came out. But I mean, title challengers, champions that would come past and present on this card. Johnny Hendricks, Dan Hardy's on this card. Anthony Rumble Johnson, Michael McDonald, and this was back in the days when they used to have Facebook prelims. So most of the prelims were on Facebook, but not all of them, and that included Johnny Hendricks' fight not being on the Facebook prelims.
Oh my goodness! Wow, what a time! What a
Weird
time.
days.
Yeah.
It was.
Alrighty, Scott, and for those people who really just need one more fight, what can they look forward to this weekend?
We've got ACA 201, which is 10 a.m. Eastern Time Friday. That streams free on aca-mma.com. The fight that I want to highlight in particular is Josiel Silva against Alexander Palesny, which is the number 20 and number 36 at 135 pounds right now. This is a real, like, high-level bantamweight fight outside the UFC. It's probably better than anybody that PFL has on their own roster, incidentally. But I will always remind that when we are talking about ACA, they do have a massively stacked roster and many of the best fighters outside of the UFC and PFL, but, also the involvement of Chechen dictator Ramzan Kadyrov, whose ownership of the promotion means the U.S. citizens and businesses cannot be involved with them because of U.S. sanctions. So, yay, fighting!
It's an interesting sport, one that we love dearly, but it has, some interesting wrinkles.
Warts and all.
Yes, has some interesting wrinkles in there. Scott, this has been a jam-packed episode. Appreciate you taking the time. As always, it is a pleasure. Hopefully you enjoyed back home. Enjoy the fights this weekend, and we will see you next week.